Welcome to Global Insights on the Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. I'm Kwangu Liwewe. On Thursday, November the 21st, the International Criminal Court issued 3 arrest warrants. The 3 suspects were the Hamas military chief, Mohammed Deif, former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Deif, who Israel claims to have killed in an air raid in July, was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including for his role in the October 7 attacks in Israel. Netanyahu and Gallant were also accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes, including the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare, and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. The warrants sent shockwaves through the international community. Netanyahu's office branded the decision anti-Semitic and the charges absurd and false, while Israel's staunch ally, the United States, fundamentally rejected the decision to issue the warrants. Meanwhile, major U.S. allies, including Canada, the United Kingdom, and various other European nations, suggested that they would abide by the warrants and arrest Netanyahu and Gallant if they were to travel to their territories. Joining me to dissect the significance of the ICC's decision in Israel, the Middle East, and globally, and to assess what this means for the court going forward, are Itamar Mann, a professor at the University of Haifa's Faculty of Law, specializing in international law, and New Lines magazine's Middle East editor, Kareem Shaheen. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Itamar, I'll start with you, and I'd like us to start by unpacking the ICC's arrest warrants. Much has been made of the case in the International Court of Justice, accusing the Israeli state of genocide. But this is not that. In fact, this is much more specific, right? Explain to us what the ICC warrants for its 3 suspects accused them of.
Okay, so in many cases, this goes back much further than the ICJ case submitted by South Africa under the Genocide Convention. This really goes back about a decade and a half since the Palestinian National Authority, or Palestine, tried to become a member of the Rome Statute, and indeed was accepted as a member of the Rome Statute in a very important decision from February 2021. And the ICC, it has to do with personal responsibility of individuals under criminal law. Since the war began on October 7th, the investigation took a new turn and really focused on the events during the war, during the very considerable catastrophe imposed upon Gaza, and specifically on the issue of starvation, which seems to, and the denial of humanitarian aid, which seems to be the center of the investigation right now. And really, the 2 individual suspects that have been identified with these arrest warrants, Netanyahu and Gallant, are only, the civilian leaders of a much broader set of events that may implicate Israeli soldiers in different ranks in the future. But at this time, it is limited to these 2 individuals for their own criminal responsibility as co-perpetrators of several crimes against humanity, as you said, centered on starvation and causing, very, very grave damage to Palestinian health, the right to health of civilians, as well as murder, as you described in your question, indeed.
Just picking up on that, but the ICC actually issued arrest warrants against former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir and others for crimes including genocide. So how come these 2 cases are just totally different?
Well, I would not say that they are totally different. They have many, similarities and issues that will come up in both of them. Most centrally, the issue of head of state immunity that came up as a defense in the context of Omar al-Bashir, including by South Africa when Omar al-Bashir visited South Africa, and is surely going to be part of the issues that will be discussed in the context of Palestine. And we already know this from statements, for example, by U.S. government officials who had suggested that they recognized the immunity of Prime Minister Netanyahu under head of state immunity, which is disallowed under the Rome statutes. So there are interesting commonalities between these 2 cases.
Now, this is not the first time a sitting head of state has had an arrest warrant issued. I've just mentioned al-Bashir, and also in 2023, there was one issued for Russian President Vladimir Putin. What makes these arrests for Netanyahu and others groundbreaking?
When we are thinking about Putin, we're thinking about the person who has fashioned himself today as the major enemy, if you will, of the West. And this, of course, has a longer background going back to the Cold War and the new Cold War in the context of Ukraine and the long war in Ukraine. So there isn't a relationship of enmity with the West here. And there's a long-standing critique of the ICC, according to which the ICC only prosecutes African leaders. And when Putin received this arrest warrant, people said, okay, the ICC is now a universal court. But that was still questionable in the context in which, as I said, he's an enemy of the West. And now we have Western, not only allies, but people whose actions have been funded by the US and have been armed by the US for a very long time. And this has some precedent in the context of Afghanistan, where there was also an attempt to obtain jurisdiction for US officials in Afghanistan. But it is the first time where we have, as you said, real arrest warrants issued.
Kareem, maybe you can come in here. Can you situate this decision for us in the history of the court and the Middle East region? In the 2 decades since this court has been operating, what kind of authority and influence has the court had in the Middle East?
In the past, the main Arab country or the main Middle Eastern country that has kind of suffered from its connections to the ICC has been Libya. And, as a result of the transfer of cases related to Libya to the ICC during the civil war there. But I think one interesting aspect of it is that it has had really very little impact on current Libyan politics in a way. People don't really hear much about the court's prior cases in Libya. It certainly hasn't deterred the ongoing quest to dominate Libyan politics, and prior to that, the military operations that have kind of slowed down in more recent years. In general, the problem with the court, and this is something that isn't specific to the Middle East, is that it's often seen as a political means to an end, right? So you support the court and you support war crimes investigations in it, so long as those crimes affect your rivals or affect your enemies, and the mere suggestion that those investigations might touch upon your own loyalists or your own troops or your own administrations, it becomes then a question of, that court is politicized. My experience has been primarily with the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which was investigating the political assassinations in Lebanon between 2005 and 2006 of anti-Syrian politicians, and the court closed down after sentencing a Hezbollah operative to life in prison for his involvement in the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. And over there, you could always almost predict to the word the way people were going to react to any decisions by the court, any indictments, any arrest warrants. And if you were pro-Syrian government, pro-Hezbollah, then you condemned the court as a tool of Israeli intelligence in the West. And if you were a member of the coterie of people who were assassinated as a result of their political stances, you saw the court as an unrelenting tool for justice. And, for the ICC to be perceived as something more than simply a tool. Obviously, right now it's in the good graces of a lot of the Arab publics because it is seen as one of the few international institutions that is trying to hold Israel to account. But it's really difficult, and I think it's a question that goes to the heart of international justice as an institution. And I think the fact that, as Itamar alluded to, the court is kind of seeing this more expansive view of its jurisdiction is, I think, good for its future, and I think good for the future of international justice, because you can't simply argue that it is justice if the only people that you go after are African dictators who do not have the political cover to shield them from ICC investigations.
I just want to intervene, if I can, a little bit on that aspect, right, of this being good for the court. So I think, on a legal analysis level, I do not dispute that there's grounds for this investigation. And I think there is an interesting question about jurisdiction, but surely in terms of the facts, there is a good reason to pursue this. Whether it will be good for the court or not is a very, very interesting and hard question. We are in the context of a very dramatic political moment around the world, obviously. And with the new administration in Washington, D.C., it seems more than plausible that multiple countries that will try to abide by these orders will be exposed to various forms of sanction. And this can create a dynamic whereby the court loses its legitimacy for certain parts of the world and then becomes really important and really a kind of flag for other parts of the world. And the political dynamic that you just described, and very interestingly, in the context of Libya and Lebanon, will be reiterated and reperformed on a global scale. I think we're already seeing the start of that. And arguably, that is a very difficult situation for meting out universal and seemingly objective justice.
Just picking up on that. So, what really happens to the ICC's reputation if more countries refuse to enforce these warrants, especially with figures like Netanyahu and Putin? Is this a make or break moment for the court? Kareem?
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing this already play out in where I am in Canada. Justin Trudeau did not directly say we're going to arrest Netanyahu if he comes to Canada, but he did say that Canada is obliged to follow through on the ICC's precepts as a signatory to the Rome Statute and is therefore bound by the ICC's decisions. And on the other side of the political spectrum, there's an election likely to come in the next few months in Canada, and so it's become political football. So his opponents, the Conservatives, are saying that it's a betrayal of our ally, it's anti-Semitic, it's pro-Hamas to take that position. Now, I mean, I am wondering what the practical implications of this are going to be on a broader scale. Putin, for example, was unable to attend the BRICS summit in South Africa due to the potential risk of getting arrested. And there's going to be quite a few places where Netanyahu is probably going to think twice before he goes there. I do wonder what the practical value ultimately of that is. I wrote a piece last week and I kind of argued a little bit that there is some value, I think, to labeling things as they are. Netanyahu was pointedly not accused of genocide. He was accused of committing war crimes and of crimes against humanity. And I think there is some value to being able to label things in a way that allows us then to discuss them in a more informed way. When the war in Gaza was starting, it was instantly labeled by activists as a genocide by Israel. And I'm not arguing one way or the other that it is, but it is, I think, important that an established institution gave a name to what is happening in Gaza and what happened to Israeli civilians on October 7th. And I think that that's important moving forward in terms of delineating what we're actually talking about in the context of the conflict.
Okay, and just picking up on your point about Canada's stance on all of this. Now, if we compare Canada's response to that of the US, which called the ICC's decision outrageous, what does that tell us about the various Western nations and how they see the mechanisms of international justice like the ICC?
Okay, so I'm located now not in Canada and also not in Haifa, where I usually am. I'm located in Germany. And Germany is a really interesting case in point because it is a very good friend of Israel, and it sees itself as historically responsible for the Jewish people because of the Holocaust. Obviously, this is extraordinarily central to so-called memory culture over here. But on the other hand, it's a great believer, ostensibly or not ostensibly, in the rule of law. And Germany has taken a very, very opaque position right now. Like Canada, it's facing an election season coming up, and since the government here was dissolved. And I think that it's trying to say that it has objections on purely legal grounds and to try to remove itself from this kind of soccer game dynamic that you just described. But I don't know that will be successful. So on a domestic level, it's a really interesting case to look at. So with regard to the effectiveness argument, so you talk about naming things for what they are, and I think that's an important part of it. I think also that it's really important to remember that this is one legal process among many legal processes that are going on in parallel, and not only at the ICJ in The Hague, but also in domestic courts, including courts that are reconsidering issues that have to do with arms sales and exports to Israel. And that, I think, is where there might be some important influence here in terms of the influence that the ICC may have on domestic courts to push them forward to, press a kind of break or raise a red flag in terms of arms exports to Israel, which is a very, very important issue that has material effects for the way that Israel can or cannot conduct its continued war in Gaza. And Israel, as far as I can see, is not planning to leave Gaza anytime soon. And this will indeed generate a condition where there is continued armed struggles and conflict. And if this is labeled as crimes against humanity by the ICC, it very may well be the case that domestic courts will be more sympathetic to cases that try to prevent some of the arms from arriving in Israel.
So, one aspect of war and the conduct of warfare over the past few years has been, I think, the denigration of customary law, in a sense. What's acceptable in war. We've seen a lot of hospital bombings in Syria in particular, and then in Russia and Ukraine. And I'm wondering if the ICC kind of going forward with this case and with war crimes investigations, with crimes against humanity investigations, if this is also kind of a staking your ground situation where the court is saying, if we see these crimes being committed, we're not just going to stand back and let them happen, because not prosecuting them normalizes them and makes it okay for these crimes to be committed, because customary law is only law if you actually enforce it, right? Do you think that is going to have an impact in terms of the conduct of warfare over the next few years?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it goes to several developments that we have seen over probably 2 decades now, not only in the context of Israeli warfare, but also in the context of US warfare, especially with the practice of targeting across the Middle East, and in the context of warfare, for example, by an actor such as Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And there is a kind of watering down of basic rules of customary international law when it comes to war. Interestingly, however, Kareem Khan, in his arrest warrant and the statements that accompanied it, did not focus on proportionality, which is the major rule in the customary international law area called IHL, International Humanitarian Law, or the law of armed conflict. He did rather emphasize the more novel and the more exceptional aspect of this particular conflict that have to do with, as I said, humanitarian aid, and also to a very large extent relate to the particular history of Gaza as a place that has been under siege for many years, and arguably on and off since 1967, but especially since 2006, when Israel left Gaza, or left the direct occupation of Gaza, and with various small breaks, but with a very powerful closure since October 2023. So all that is to say that I think the way that this is framed, and that is not by any means necessary, it could have been done otherwise, is not that applicable to other conflicts where I have not really seen the same aspects of a very strict and long-term siege leading ultimately to widespread hunger, if not famine. So yeah, I think that it's calibrated in a way that really focuses on this area and sends a message, hopefully, to other leaders around the world that hunger is not a legitimate means of warfare, which is, maybe to some listeners this will be a surprise, but this is not at all an entirely settled point under IHL, where some instruments do allow for the imposition of hunger if there's a specific military objective involved. So it remains to be seen. It's really a political question that will take years until we find out the answer to it. But sitting and reflecting on this conflict, I sometimes thought to myself, I hope this conflict ends with an enormous multilateral treaty that will disallow hunger as a method of warfare. And that would be, a kind of hopeful ending for an enormously catastrophic and possibly genocidal situation. But when I look at global politics right now, and I look at the dynamics not only in the US, but also in many parts of Europe, it's a question in my mind whether an institution like the ICC, that ultimately doesn't have, as we always say, police, and doesn't have an enormous budget, it either can push the needle towards that very, otherwise hopeful direction.
Okay, now, Itamar, there was a lot of criticism from Israel and its allies about the fact that the ICC issued these warrants at the same time as those for Deif, with the US President Joe Biden actually saying they imply a false equivalence between Israel and Hamas. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I think this is really a regrettable point for Washington, D.C. to make. I think that it is possible. This is a little bit of a speculation, but I don't think it's too much of a speculation that the reason Kareem Khan decided to include Mohammed Deif in the list of people that he requested arrest warrants for was to create a certain kind of balance, as it were, not to go only against Israeli leaders, while it is at least quite clear within Israeli discourse that Deif was killed by Israel. So he was apprehensive in terms of issuing arrest warrants only towards Israeli suspects, even though the suspects that he singled out, 3 in number initially, were probably all killed by Israel since. And now the US is saying, we don't want an equivalence. And there is no equivalence in the sense that 2 suspects are probably alive and 1 suspect is probably dead. But in terms of the accusations, Mohammed Deif did get accused of the crime of extermination. Kareem Khan did not accuse Gallant or Netanyahu of the crime of extermination, which is the worst of crimes that is enumerated among the accusations. And I think that ultimately there is a certain kind of equivalence also in the fact that there is evidence that all sides have been acting in a way that amounts to war crimes or crimes against humanity. There's no way around that. And I simply see this as a very regrettable point of propaganda with no real legal basis, I'm afraid.
Okay, just taking you back to the reaction of these arrest warrants. The Republican Party in the US has threatened to levy sanctions against individuals within the ICC, such as the chief prosecutor, Kareem Khan, ICC staff, and the ICC judges. These sanctions could include freezing their US bank accounts and perhaps even banning them from traveling to the United States. The US has done this in the past. We saw this when it sanctioned former chief prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. Now, what would the impact be on the court and its international standing if the upcoming Trump administration were to implement these sanctions, Kareem?
I think that the Trump administration in the past has shown a disregard for the rule of law, for international law. Not that they necessarily disagree with the ultimate aims of various military campaigns, or, for example, it was Trump that really bombed the Assad regime briefly after the chemical weapons attack in 2017 took place, and he very memorably called Assad an animal, and yet they have no interest in having the court see itself, I think, as this arbiter of war crimes beyond the initial capacity of prosecuting people who have already signed on to the Rome Statute or have been referred to the court by the Security Council. So in reality, the U.S. was never going to implement any of these decisions. The U.S. does not see itself as bound by the court. There's a reason that there's a law on the books in the U.S. that allows it to invade The Hague if any war crime, if any of its servicemen is accused of war crimes and is detained by the court or other international tribunals. So ultimately, the U.S. was never going to implement any of this. I do think that if it does take the extra step of actually sanctioning court officials or banning them from travel, it's going to be a huge problem for the US, I think, primarily more than anyone else. Part of it is obviously the fact that there is strong backing for the court's decisions and for its legitimacy. It's going to be yet another one of those political football elements in international politics where the US and its allies are on one side and the rest of the world are on the other side. It will persist in causing I think, problems in future elections, particularly given that this is something that's backed by both political sides in the U.S. The Democrats said pretty much the same thing when the possibility of arrest warrants was presented under the Biden administration, and the Biden administration is obviously still in power. And so they were never going to implement any of this stuff. But I do wonder, and I think Itamar might be better positioned to answer that question, is what is the breaking point? What is the red line at which point they will actually implement a lot of these actions? And I remember a few months ago, Lindsey Graham, the U.S. senator, said that they're going to come after us next, right? And he sounded very indignant about the prospect. And so ultimately the question of whether the U.S. places sanctions on ICC officials is a question of whether the U.S. is willing to abide by international law and willing to subject its own officials to any kind of international justice. And clearly they're not. And so that's where we're at right now.
Itamar, your take on the sanctions?
I think that it may be the case that if the Trump administration will look like it seems it will, we're going to see more than sanctions this time. We're going to see bullying of third states that are member states that the ICC statute, with a kind of orientation where Washington is saying basically, you need to act as we think it is appropriate to act and withdraw from this court or basically ignore this court, or else we will, and the rest is yet to be determined. But in this context, I really think it's important to remember that Europe is completely dependent on the US in terms of its security in the context of the way NATO works. And if the US decides to put a lot of weight on this issue and other issues concerning international law to basically kind of dictate the positions of other countries that are dependent on the US in terms of military support, this can be a very extraordinary moment of crisis for the ICC, but also for the so-called rule-based international order more broadly. My second hat is as a refugee and migration lawyers. In our community, people are thinking that the US may choose to defund not only UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, but also very well may be the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And of course, the Paris Accords in terms of climate is something that we already know that Trump will likely move away from. So this creates a much larger context. And I think I agree with Kareem ultimately that this is bad for the US, because even if for the short term, other countries will be threatened and will change their behavior accordingly, and maybe political powers within them will also try to take a more US oriented outlook, I think in the longer term, there will be no buy-in for this kind of policy, and there will be a backlash against the US if it tries to kind of bully the world according to particular measures that it feels are more appropriate. And much of the world, both in the global north and in the global south, is strongly opposed to. It's going to be a very significant time of turmoil. As an Israeli, I'm very unhappy that my country and my people are somehow at the center of this turmoil. But I think right now it's almost a fait accompli that this is what we're going to see, and that there will be a period of turmoil and then a period of backlash against the US. And this will not ultimately be in favor of US interests around the world.
If I can just add one little point to this, just in the context of the Middle East, I think the Arab countries that are allied with the U.S., whether that's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., especially the ones that have signed peace treaties with Israel, they know how to deal with Trump. They understand his transactional nature. They understand his business-oriented approach to deal making and to dealing with the region's autocrats. And they've been growing increasingly concerned over the past years of the Israeli government's penchant for seeing violence as a solution in and of itself to a lot of the crises in the region, whether that's in Lebanon, whether that's in Gaza. And the likelihood of these peace treaties expanding and taking hold with greater depth in the region and among the populace is shrinking as these issues are ongoing. And the possibility that Trump could put some pressure on these countries to allow, for example, for a visit from Netanyahu or to condemn the court. Most of these are not signatories to the ICC and to the Rome Statute to begin with. But I think that they have reached a point due to the way political events have been progressing in the region over the past year. They've reached a point where they understand where are the pressure points. They understand when to give way to U.S. priorities and when not to. And so that's going to be a limiting factor to, in the region at least, to the U.S. agenda when it comes to the ICC and when it comes to seeking global consensus against the court.
Picking up from what Kareem has talked about, the Middle East countries dealing with these pressure points, my question now is, with the ICC, can they withstand this pressure from Trump's administration? And do you think there's a chance the court could rescind the warrants?
The only chance that I see that the court will rescind warrants is in a very, very unlikely situation in which we will see a kind of two-state solution negotiation beginning. And then there's a process called deferral, in which case it's not really rescinding the warrants, but it's freezing it, to use a colloquial term here, in order not to impede a peace process that is going on. Many of the discussions within our field of international criminal law over the years have been about the idea of peace versus justice, or justice versus peace. So if these two purposes, very important purposes, are in tension with one another, there are tools, doctrinal tools, that the court has in order to allow for peace, to attempt to bring about peace. And of course, with the Oslo Accords, we did have a peace process, but that has been dead for many, many years. And the most optimistic take one can think of is that Trump comes into the White House, says, I have some peace plan, some enormous glitzy deal that I'm going to broker here. And Netanyahu is willing to go with that and shows that he is willing, for example, to meet Palestinian leaders or have real negotiations about a solution. In that case, I don't think the arrest warrants will continue as they are. But I, once again, think it's very, very unlikely that we will see that.
And when the prosecutor made reference to the door to complementarity continues to remain open, what are the chances that an investigation into Netanyahu within Israel might see the ICC consider withdrawing its warrants?
So this is a really interesting issue. The short answer is that I think that the prosecution, my opinion is that the prosecution in Israel right now is already too weak, even if it wanted to do so, to really investigate the underlying crimes, including crimes against the prime minister and the former minister of security, minister of defense, and many other potential crimes that need to be investigated, despite the fact that there are many open cases since the beginning of the war. But this is the usual strategy, to have open cases, and then they kind of remain open. So I don't think this is a real obstacle to the ICC, this complementarity issue. That's my opinion. But I do think there's another layer here that is also very, very interesting, which is that the complementarity issue has a kind of internal dynamic that it has taken. Kareem alluded earlier to internal dynamics in Libya as well as in Lebanon that have to do with international criminal processes. In Israel, there is an internal dynamic around complementarity, because we also have, since a few years now, an initiative to weaken the prosecution and the court considerably in a way that will center much more power in the executive branch. People compare this to the model that Turkey has, for example. So within this context, people who want to empower the prosecution and want to empower the court have been saying, this is a Hebrew expression, the translation of which is that the court is our armor against bullets. So, and the bullets here are the ICC arrest warrants, for example. So if we want to protect ourselves, we need to embolden and empower the courts and the prosecution to do their jobs. But this, in turn, has also caused a backlash dynamic whereby it now, the prosecution and the courts are now sometimes framed by ethno-nationalist right-wing actors as somehow collaborating with this foreign body called the ICC, and therefore as traitors. So I think that this may, spin even into more force. Remember that our prime minister is under criminal investigation and prosecution and has a trial right now, in fact, and has to testify in a little bit in his own trial. And there are right-wing forces that will take this as an opportunity to show that what the prosecution is doing against Israeli soldiers is collaborating with a foreign actor.
Kareem, maybe you can come in here and tell us what you think this news, or rather, how is this news being received by the populations of the various Arab majority countries in the region? Will they see these warrants more as symbolic, or do they think that Netanyahu and Gallant will actually appear in court one day?
I don't think anyone's under any impression that they might actually appear in court at any moment. It feels like, that the court has validated a lot of emotions and a lot of emotional reactions to what's been happening in Gaza. Obviously, people in the region have been following events very closely, whether that's in Lebanon or in Palestine, and people try to find these sort of rays of light in the darkness that they perceive as being their own political victimhood and an ostracization. People generally perceive all of international institutions as being partial to the United States, partial to the West, partial to Israel as a consequence of all of this. And they tend to fixate on particular events that validate this idea and that validate their perception of the real world. One curious thing about the age we're living in, where Elon Musk owned Twitter, is that it doesn't seem like there's anything really real anymore, that there isn't a set of facts that we can all agree on as being objective or as being rooted in reality. And so when you have things like international institutions issuing an arrest warrant that align with your political beliefs and align with your political values, there is a sense of validation there, and there's a sense that at least there's this. And obviously, this does not change any of the bleak reality that civilians in Gaza or in Lebanon are facing, the grim realities that they're living through. But it does offer some kind of psychological victory or psychological validation to some of these publics that what they're suffering through, it's actually real, and that this bizarre situation in which the entire world is watching or is standing aside as a lot of these crimes are occurring, whether the crimes that are committed by Hamas operatives or that are committed by the Israeli military, that there is someone out there who is keeping track of them and who is saying that they are actually crimes, whether or not people are held to account at the end.
And finally, does this actually mark a new era for international justice or the beginning of the end of the court? I'll throw that to both of you.
I mean, I can take it first, but I'm only going to say that I agree with you fully, with Itamar fully, because it is a very dangerous moment. I think it's really important that the court is pursuing this kind of expanded jurisdiction over crimes that were not traditionally perceived as within its remit, whether or not this has actual practical value or whether or not this ultimately leads to the collapse of the court. And that's because I think that the past was not tenable. I don't think that you can present the idea that this court was going after African dictators who did not have political cover from the US or Russia and continue to pursue those cases against them solely it was a kind of valid way forward. I don't think it's justice if it can only be applied to the weak. But I do very strongly agree with Itamar that what we might end up seeing is the end of the court if the U.S. decides to pursue this extremely belligerent approach of sanctions and of banning court officials from traveling. A lot of court officials have accounts in the U.S. in fact, because the UN Federal Credit Union is based in New York. So these are threats with real teeth, and it could very well lead to the collapse of the court or the collapse of the rules-based international order, as Itamar phrased it before. And so it's a really dangerous, fraught moment. But I also don't think that there was any other choice. I don't think that it was possible to continue with business as usual without pursuing court cases like the arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin or the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And maybe the fact that Putin is also one of the indictees of the court maybe gives it some saving grace in the months to come as we try to see how the U.S. is going to react to trying to enforce these warrants.
So I think that if we look historically at least modern international law, we see this pattern of crisis and then reemergence in a new institutional form. I think the most important and well-known example is the way that in 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact aimed to illegalize warfare, save for the very small exception of defense. And then that was completely rebuffed at the beginning of World War II when Hitler invaded Poland and all the events that followed. So that was a big moment in which the international order of the time, that of the League of Nations, collapsed. But then after World War II, of course, we have the establishment of the UN Charter, and the fundamental treaties that are kind of the bread and butter of our discipline today. It may be the case that with the war in Palestine, Gaza, with the war in Ukraine and the crisis around it, and with a number of other very important crises around the world, including in Sudan and other parts, we are seeing another moment of collapse. This is a very scary prospect because, as you know, when we talk about the previous precedent, we also talked about probably the most bloody world war that the world ever had. So it's enormously scary. But in the longer term, I do think that international law in some form will reemerge. International law is always also a reflection of power and of a certain stability that global powers try to impose around the world. The modern so-called liberal rule-based international order is essentially based on an agreement between the Western and the Eastern blocs that were the bipolar structure of the world for the entire Cold War. And others have said that what we're seeing right now is still a kind of hangover from the collapse of that order. What I'm saying is that we are living through an enormously dramatic moment with potential dangers and potential transformations. But we should also be kind of trying to keep our head above the water and open our eyes to see what can be the new formation that will emerge after, and how can we mitigate the enormous human suffering that this crisis is inflicting upon the Middle East and upon the world. It really depends a lot on whether we will be talking about the actors as the US, Russia, and China, or India, or who will be there at the table. But there will be a new order that will be formed. And maybe, one can speculate, and maybe this is a good place to end this conversation, on other actors as well, and on the role of technology in generating that kind of order. But this is the end of something and the birth of something new. That's how I feel.
You've been listening to Global Insights on the Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead, where you'll find global insights the last Friday of every month. Thank you for joining us.